major intervention from the president today, indicating that he's prepared to use the military, to bring in the military, although it's difficult to see what the actual legal basis for that would be. We've seen the president attacking the state governors, branding them as weak, telling them that they must dominate, that they'll be seen as jerks if they don't take a stronger position. Clearly, these demonstrations are complicated because they're made up of a coalition of forces. We have a lot of peaceful demonstrators concerned about social justice, concerned about racism, but then we have professional political agitators who are there stirring up trouble, stirring up violence. Then we have other people who are engaging in looting, simply hoping to...
But it's gone on now for a considerable period of time, and the onus is certainly on the authorities to use what means they can to bring these demonstrations to a halt in terms of their violence. And I think one of the critical tests here, of course, is how leaders are responding. Trump is responding in an aggressive and divisive way. That should surprise nobody. But what the Democrats have got to do is they've got to indicate that while they're supportive of people protesting against racism, they won't accept violent demonstrations, and that they are prepared to act in a very resolute way against violence.
Peter Hartcher, what's your reaction to what you've seen over the last, as Paul said, it's 7 days now since the murder of George Floyd?
Well, what I'm seeing, Kieran, is an accumulation of crises. We see the coronavirus problem, with the US now accounting for about 1/3 of all coronavirus declared deaths worldwide. Compounding that, we see an economic crisis with some 40 million Americans thrown out of work in the last 2 months. And now on top of that, we see race riots and rights crisis and a law and order crisis. Each of those hasn't come out of the blue. They're not new. The problem is not just the accumulating nature and the fact that each is layered on top of the other. The problem is that each of them is a new iteration of a long-standing unsolved problem in the US. The race problem, which obviously hasn't been dealt with, and the problem of police conduct with black people. The economic problem is layered on top of long festering problems of dreadful inequality, and a new layer of economic suffering on top of large pockets of American underclass, really, is another aggravation of that. Plus the health problem with coronavirus on a ramshackle health system, the only industrial country in the world that doesn't have universal health care. So that's what I see, Kieran. I see a compounding series of crises with no problem-solving mechanism on hand, problem-solving mechanism being the political system. The problem-solving mechanism, instead of trying to solve the problem, either the immediate confrontation or the longer-running underlying problems, is trying to take advantage. Paul's just talked about the president trying to actually fueling the divisions and the anger. This is not an act of national leadership. This is an act of partisan exploitation. This is not going to help the country. It may help Donald Trump's re-election. Who knows? There's many months to go still. But it is an absolutely incendiary situation.
Paul Kelly, we are 5 months, in fact, from the election date. Donald Trump reminded us of that with a tweet overnight, as he does with the date of the presidential election. How much of that is driving the behaviour that we're seeing now, that picture opportunity at St John's Church across the road from the White House, his message that he's the law and order president?
Well, the answer is absolutely. Donald Trump is in political trouble. He's had the two combined crises of the health crisis, the virus, which has been mismanaged by him and by the United States, which is a very severe reflection on the quality of American governance and the health system. More than 100,000 Americans have died. Then we've got the economic crisis, and we'll probably see unemployment heading towards 20%, and that particularly affects black Americans. They are hurt far more in a disproportionate sense by both these crises, the health crisis and the economic crisis. Now, what Trump is doing from this particular position of difficulty is he's seizing upon this crisis. We see two competing views of the United States now. Trump is basically saying these demonstrations are about law and order. There are anarchists at work. There are professional stirrers at work. There are people at work creating trouble. This is a question of law and order, and I am the president who can deal with this. The Democrats are weak. They're ineffective. They're appeasers. They can't handle this sort of situation. So that's what Trump's saying. On the other hand, of course, this should benefit Joe Biden, because essentially we see a president putting his personal self-interest ahead of the interests of the United States. The question is whether Biden has got the convincing ability and capacity to seize upon this situation and take the lead from Trump in a decisive way and win the election. Now, I can't predict what's going to happen there. This is a very dispiriting American campaign between Trump on the one hand and a very unconvincing Joe Biden on the other.
Bruce Hawker, who I spoke to earlier in the program, Peter Harcher, said that his contacts in the United States are raising with him the fear that even if Donald Trump were to lose in November, that he's already trying to question the legitimacy of the vote via mail-outs and so on already. That sounds like a real fear in some quarters in the US, Peter.
Yes, I mean, it's that even that is not new. Going back to Trump's election first time round in 2016, you might remember, Kieran, he didn't rule out the possibility that if he lost the election, that he would recognise the legitimacy of his rival's success, Clinton's success. He kept open the option even then that he would refuse to recognise the legitimacy of the electoral system in the US, and I don't know what he had in mind exactly. So there's sound basis for that fear that Trump may either try to skew the outcome, refuse to acknowledge it if he were to lose. This is not an orthodox president, but really, I mean, what Trump represents is a despair of the American system at trying to apply orthodox policy to get rational outcomes to improve the national situation. Trump represents a kind of a Shiva, a god of destruction, brought an angry, elected by an angry and frustrated America, or section of America, that was sick of the failure of orthodox politics, embraced a man who said he was going to bust up the existing system, and that's what he continues to do, even when it's at its most perilous.
And as it is at this perilous time, it did not stop the president from getting on with other measures to, I guess, isolate China is one way it's being read, but expanding the G7, Paul Kelly, to include Australia, and the president spoke to the Prime Minister about that a couple of hours ago.
Well, he did, and the president is doing these things. But look, the bigger point to make here, Kieran, is that the United States, because of its inception, because of its role in the 20th century, is undoubtedly the leading liberal democracy in the world. And liberal democracy is in trouble. We had President Putin of Russia say not all that long ago that liberalism was a finished ideal. We can see what dictators around the world would be doing when they look at this situation in the United States. I mean, the Chinese couldn't be so lucky. At the very time they're attempting to change the fundamental equation in China and negate parliamentary representation in China and its meaning and the one country, two systems model. At the very time the Chinese are trying to do that, the United States is burning. So we should have no doubt from what President Xi has said that he sees the competition between the United States and China not just in strategic terms. He's made it clear this is a competition of systems, and Donald Trump is representing the American system at this point in time. Well, look at the consequences, look at where we are, and have no doubt at all that this has got much wider geostrategic significance.
Yeah, indeed. Peter Harcher, only a minute left on the program, but your final thoughts on how this may play out. It's so hard to predict, but what's the scenario from here?
Well, on the truly big picture that Paul's just touched on, this is the time when the Chinese system should be on the defensive over its attempt to cover up the COVID virus, which it allowed to flourish, of course. Instead, scrutiny is now on the US, and it's the US on the defensive. And this is a terrible moment. And the Chinese need do nothing except allow the news coverage of the US to speak for itself. This is indeed a terrible moment for the American Republic, as well as what you might loosely call the American empire. And Australia needs to be very careful of Trump's invitation to join this group if it is, in fact, being set up as an anti-China lobby.